The sheriff's deputy stood on my dock, reading from the legal document in his hands, while Margaret Henderson, our HOA president, smirked behind him like she'd just won the lottery. "Sir, you're being served with a cease and desist order. All fishing activities on Willow Lake must stop immediately, or you'll face a $500 daily fine." I looked down at the boss, still flopping in my net, then back at Margaret's triumphant face. She had no idea what was coming. Because 3 months earlier, while she was busy plotting to destroy my peaceful retirement, I'd quietly purchased something that would make her regret ever crossing me: the water rights to the entire lake. But let me back up and tell you how a simple fishing hobby turned into the most satisfying revenge I've ever served cold 6 months ago. Life was perfect. After 30 years of corporate hell, I'd finally retired to my dream home on Willow Lake, a modest 2-bedroom cottage with the most spectacular view you could imagine. Every morning at sunrise, I'd cast my line into those crystal-clear waters, watching the mist roll across the surface while waiting for that telltale tug on my rod. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had seemed harmless enough when I moved in. Standard rules about lawn maintenance, fence heights, the usual suburban nonsense. I paid my dues, kept my property immaculate, and minded my own business. What I didn't realize was that Margaret Henderson, a 40-something real estate agent with perfectly manicured nails and the personality of a rabid wolverine, had been watching me from day one. "Fishing is so primitive," she'd mentioned during my first neighborhood barbecue, wrinkling her nose as if I'd admitted to clubbing baby seals. "This is an upscale community, Frank. We maintain certain standards." I should have seen the warning signs. The way other neighbors went quiet when Margaret spoke. How quickly conversations ended when she approached. The nervous glances when anyone mentioned lake activities. But I was too busy enjoying my retirement to notice the storm brewing. Margaret lived in the largest house on the lake, a gaudy McMansion with columns that served no purpose except to scream, "Look at me." Her husband, Richard, was some kind of investment banker who worked 18-hour days and barely acknowledged his wife's existence. Maybe that's why she spent so much time making everyone else miserable. The first shot across my bow came disguised as a friendly visit. Margaret knocked on my door on a Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand, wearing her fake smile like armor. "Frank, darling, we need to talk about your fishing situation." She stepped inside without invitation, her heels clicking on my hardwood floors. "Several residents have complained about the unsightly equipment on your dock." I followed her gaze through my sliding glass door. My tackle box, 2 folding chairs, and a small cooler sat neatly arranged on my 10-foot dock. Everything was clean, organized, and barely visible from the street. "What equipment?" I asked. "Well, there's also the matter of fish smell." Margaret's nose crinkled again. "And the early morning noise. Your boat motor wakes the entire neighborhood at dawn." I stared at her. "I don't have a boat. The fishing itself is becoming quite the eyesore, Frank. This is a prestigious community, and we simply can't have residents engaging in such activities where everyone can see." That's when it hit me. This wasn't about fishing regulations or community standards. Margaret Henderson wanted me gone, and fishing was just her opening move. "I'll review the HOA bylaws," I said carefully, "but I don't recall any restrictions on fishing." Her smile turned razor sharp. "Oh, you sweet man. There will be." 2 weeks later, the first official letter arrived, certified mail, return receipt requested. Margaret wasn't messing around. "Dear Mr. Thompson," it began, "the Willowbrook Estates HOA board has received multiple complaints regarding fishing activities at 1247 Lakeshore Drive. After careful consideration, we are implementing new community standards effective immediately." The new rules were surgical in their precision. No fishing equipment could be stored outside. No fishing between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., my favorite time. No fish cleaning on residential property. No live bait storage. Each violation carried a $100 fine, escalating to $500 for repeat offenses. I called an emergency meeting with my next-door neighbor, Tom Rodriguez, a retired contractor who'd become my closest friend in the neighborhood. "This is bullshit, Frank," Tom said, reading over the letter. "She's targeting you specifically. I've been grilling on my deck every weekend for 5 years, and nobody complains about the smell or noise from that. Can she do this legally?" Tom rubbed his gray beard thoughtfully. "Technically, yeah. If the board votes these rules into the bylaws, they become enforceable. But here's the thing, Margaret's been stacking the board with her cronies. The vote's already rigged." That night, I sat on my dock, watching the sunset paint the water gold and red, wondering if this would be one of my last peaceful evenings here. The boss were jumping near the fallen log across the cove, and a great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I should have realized then that Margaret and I weren't so different. We were both predators, patient and calculating. The difference was, she was about to discover she'd chosen the wrong prey. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a sterile white building that looked more like a medical clinic than a gathering place. I arrived 15 minutes early to find Margaret already holding court, surrounded by her faithful followers, Janet Morrison, the neighborhood gossip, Dr. Patricia Wells, a humorless dermatologist, and Bob Cunningham, a recently divorced accountant who'd do anything for Margaret's approval. 23 homeowners showed up, but I could count my allies on one hand. Tom Rodriguez gave me an encouraging nod from across the room. Sarah Chen, a young software engineer who kept to herself, offered a sympathetic smile. Everyone else either avoided eye contact or whispered among Margaret's inner circle. "Tonight, we address a growing problem in our community," Margaret began, her voice carrying the authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Residents engaging in activities that lower property values and disturb the peaceful enjoyment of our homes." She'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation, actual slides. The first showed a before and after comparison stock photos of pristine lakefront properties, next to zoomed-in shots of my tackle box and chairs. "Fishing equipment creates visual pollution," she declared, advancing to the next slide. "The odors from cleaned fish attract insects and scavengers. Early morning activities disrupt the tranquility our residents purchased when they chose Willowbrook Estates." Tom stood up. "Margaret, Frank's been fishing responsibly for 6 months. His property is immaculate, and I've never seen or smelled anything offensive. With respect, Tom, several residents have filed formal complaints." Margaret produced a manila folder thick with papers. "I won't embarrass anyone by reading names, but the concerns are numerous and specific." I requested to see the complaints. Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment. "The names are redacted to protect privacy, but the board has reviewed each incident thoroughly. How about just the dates and nature of the complaints?" I pressed. "That information is confidential during the deliberation process." Sarah Chen raised her hand. "Shouldn't residents have the right to face their accusers? This seems like a kangaroo court." A murmur ran through the room. Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she recovered quickly. "We're not conducting a trial, Mrs. Chen. We're implementing reasonable community standards that protect everyone's investment. The proposed fishing restrictions are modest and fair." The vote was 4-1 in favor, with Tom Rodriguez casting the sole dissent as an honorary board observer. Janet Morrison didn't even pretend to consider the arguments. Dr. Wells cited health concerns about fish parasites. Bob Cunningham mumbled something about property values and liability. As residents filed out, Margaret approached me with that predatory smile. "Nothing personal, Frank. Sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the greater good." I understand completely, I replied. And I did. She'd just declared war, and I was about to show her what 30 years in corporate negotiations had taught me about playing the long game. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse. If Margaret wanted to play legal hardball, I needed to understand the battlefield. The Property Records Department was staffed by Helen Murphy, a 60-something woman who'd been filing deeds and surveys since before computers existed. Fishing dispute? Helen chuckled when I explained my situation. Honey, you're not the first retiree to tangle with an HOA. Let me pull the original plat for Willowbrook Estates. What she showed me was fascinating. The development had been carved out of a larger ranch property in 1987. The lake itself predated the subdivision by decades. It had been created in the 1940s when the original landowner dammed a natural stream for irrigation. Here's the interesting part, Helen said, pointing to a notation on the survey. The water rights weren't included in the original sale to the developer. They were retained by the ranch owner's estate. My pulse quickened. What does that mean exactly? Means whoever owns the water rights controls fishing, boating, swimming, basically any use of the lake itself. The homeowners around the lake have property lines that go to the water's edge, but they don't own the water. Who owns the rights now? Helen pulled up another file. Let's see. Transferred to Creek Valley Ranch LLC in 2003, then sold to Mountain Vista Holdings in 2018. She squinted at the computer screen. Looks like Mountain Vista is trying to liquidate assets. The water rights went up for sale last month. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside, I was grinning like a lottery winner. Could you print me copies of these documents? Sure thing, Honorable. Fight the good fight. That evening, I called my lawyer, David Kim, a sharp Korean-American attorney who'd handled my divorce and retirement planning. I had retained him more as insurance than necessity, but now I needed his expertise. Frank, this is either brilliant or insane, David said after I explained my idea. Buying water rights to spite your HOA falls somewhere between creative problem-solving and mutually assured destruction. How much are we talking? I'll need to research comparable sales, but for a 50-acre recreational lake, probably somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000. Can you afford that? I thought about my retirement portfolio, my corporate pension, and the equity in my paid-off house. After 30 years of living below my means and maxing out my 401k, I could afford it. The question was whether I wanted to spend that much money just to make Margaret Henderson's life miserable. Then I remembered her smug face during the board meeting, her fake sympathy when she'd handed me the fishing restrictions, the way she'd steamrolled over any reasonable discussion. Let's make an offer. Frank, I have to advise you, this is a lot of money for what amounts to revenge. David, this isn't revenge. This is justice. And besides, I smiled, have you seen what waterfront property has been selling for lately? This might be the best investment I ever make. Negotiating the water rights purchase took 6 weeks of careful maneuvering. Mountain Vista Holdings was eager to sell, but I didn't want to seem too desperate and drive up the price. David handled most of the communication, presenting me as an investor interested in recreational property development. During those 6 weeks, Margaret escalated her harassment campaign. She'd walk past my house twice daily with her little white dog, making notes on her phone whenever she spotted my fishing equipment. She organized neighborhood beautification walks that somehow always ended up critiquing my property. She even convinced the mailman to complain about fish odors, though I'd never cleaned a fish on my property. The fines started accumulating. $100 for leaving my tackle box on the dock overnight. Another $100 for fishing during quiet hours. When I challenged the quiet hours rule, pointing out that lawn mowers and leaf blowers operated during the same time frame, Margaret simply scheduled an emergency board meeting to expand the restrictions. Tom Rodriguez was furious. "She's driving you out, Frank. This is harassment, plain and simple." "Let her," I said. "Every fine she levies just makes what's coming more satisfying." On a Thursday in October, David called with news. "It's done. You are now the proud owner of all water rights for Willow Lake, including fishing, boating, swimming, and any other recreational use. Congratulations, you just bought yourself a lake." I hung up and walked onto my dock, looking out over my new domain. A family of ducks paddled near the shore, and somewhere in the depths, bass were schooling for their evening feeding. Margaret Henderson had no idea that the man she'd been trying to drive out now controlled the one thing that made Willowbrook Estate special. I waited 3 days before making my first move. On Sunday morning, while Margaret was at her country club brunch, I had a sign company install discreet private lake, no trespassing, authorized personnel, only markers at 6 locations around the water's edge. The signs were professional, weatherproof, and completely legal. The first phone call came at 2:47 p.m. "Frank Thompson, this is Margaret Henderson. What is the meaning of those signs around our lake?" "They're trespassing notices, Margaret." "And it's not your lake anymore." Silence. Then, in a voice so cold it could freeze water, "Excuse me?" "I purchased the water rights from Mountain Vista Holdings. As of Thursday, I own Willow Lake. Anyone using the water without permission is trespassing on private property." "That's impossible. This is a community lake." "Actually, it never was. The original developer retained lake access rights for residents, but never owned the water itself. I have the deed if you'd like to review it." I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow. "You can't do this. Margaret, I can do whatever I want. It's my lake." She hung up. 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang. Margaret stood on my porch with her husband Richard, Dr. Wells, and Bob Cunningham in tow. She'd called in the cavalry. "Frank, let's be reasonable adults here," Richard began. He was a tall, soft-looking man who clearly hated conflict. "Surely we can work out some arrangement?" "I'm very reasonable, Richard. In fact, I'm prepared to offer lake access permits to any resident who requests one properly." "What kind of permits?" Dr. Wells asked suspiciously. "Simple application process. Background check, liability waiver, modest processing fee. Very standard for private recreational facilities." Margaret's face was turning an interesting shade of purple. "How much?" I pretended to consider. "For fishing? $500 annually seems fair. Swimming and boating would be extra, of course. Say, $1,000 for full access." "This is extortion." "This is business, Margaret. I have significant carrying costs now: insurance, maintenance, liability coverage. These fees barely cover expenses." Bob Cunningham, the accountant, was doing rapid mental math. "That's $47,000 annually if every household pays full access fees." "Assuming everyone qualifies," I added. "The background check might disqualify some applicants." Richard shot his wife a look that could melt steel. "Margaret, what exactly did you do to this man?" The next morning, I had David draft official lake access applications. The document was 6 pages of dense legal language covering liability, environmental responsibility, noise restrictions, and behavioral standards. The background check required 3 character references, proof of homeowner's insurance, and a signed acknowledgement of my absolute authority over lake activities. But the real genius was in the fine print. Anyone who had filed noise complaints, harassment accusations, or participated in targeted enforcement actions against current permit holders would be subject to additional review and a $200 administrative fee. I hand-delivered applications to every house in Willowbrook Estates, wearing my biggest smile and most diplomatic tone. Sarah Chen answered her door in workout clothes, looking confused. What's this about, Frank? Just some paperwork to continue enjoying the lake. No big deal for anyone who's been neighborly. She scanned the first page. Frank, this is brilliant. You're making them pay for the privilege of using the lake they tried to keep you away from. I'm simply protecting my investment and ensuring responsible usage. Tom Rodriguez was already filling out his application when I reached his house. You magnificent bastard, he grinned. Margaret must be losing her mind. I wouldn't know. She hasn't applied yet. The first few days brought a steady stream of applications. Most residents were annoyed, but compliant. They wanted lake access more than they wanted to fight. Sarah Chen's application was perfect. Tom Rodriguez included a character reference from his priest. Even some of Margaret's previous allies quietly submitted their paperwork, but the inner circle held out. Margaret, Dr. Wells, Janet Morrison, and Bob Cunningham formed a resistance committee convinced they could find legal grounds to challenge my ownership. That's when I implemented Phase 2. On Wednesday morning, I spotted Dr. Wells swimming her usual laps in the lake. She was a fitness fanatic who'd been doing the same routine for 3 years out her back door at 6 a.m. sharp, 30 minutes of aggressive freestyle, then back to her house for yoga. I put on my best neighborhood watch outfit and walked down to the water's edge with my clipboard. Good morning, Dr. Wells. She stopped mid-stroke, treading water 20 feet from shore. What do you want, Frank? Just ensuring compliance with trespassing laws. Do you have your access permit? I don't need a permit to swim in the community lake. Actually, you do. This is private property now. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to exit the water immediately. This is ridiculous. I refuse. I pulled out my phone. I understand your position, but I'll need to call the sheriff's department to report trespassing. They'll need to escort you out and issue a citation. Dr. Wells' eyes widened as she realized I wasn't bluffing. She swam to shore, climbed out dripping wet, and stalked back to her house without another word. 2 hours later, Janet Morrison was sunbathing on her dock when I approached with the same clipboard. Afternoon, Janet. I notice you're enjoying the lake view. Do you have your access permit? My dock is on my property. Absolutely, but the water is mine, and your dock extends over my property line. I'll need to see proper documentation or ask you to relocate to dry land. Janet gathered her magazine and chair, muttering curses that would make a sailor blush. The pattern continued all week. Bob Cunningham was fishing from his kayak, sir. Do you have a permit for that watercraft? Margaret's grandchildren were feeding ducks from their yard. Ma'am, you're encouraging wildlife to trespass on private property. Even Margaret's little white dog became subject to enforcement when it drank from the lake during their evening walk. Each interaction was polite, professional, and absolutely maddening for the recipients. Friday afternoon brought the most satisfying confrontation yet. I was enjoying a peaceful fishing session on my dock when Margaret marched down her lawn with a professional camera, telephoto lens, and all. She positioned herself at the edge of her property and started photographing my activities with the determination of a war correspondent. Click, click, click. After 10 minutes of her amateur paparazzi routine, I reeled in my line and walked over. Lovely camera, Margaret. Professional photographer? I'm documenting your harassment of neighborhood residents for our legal case. Interesting approach. Of course, I should mention that photographing private property for commercial purposes requires permission from the property owner. She lowered the camera slightly. This isn't commercial. It's evidence gathering. For a lawsuit? That sounds pretty commercial to me. Plus, you're standing on the easement that provides access to my lake, which technically makes you trespassing while engaged in commercial photography. Margaret's grip tightened on her camera. The easement is public access. Actually, I checked. The easement grants access for maintenance and emergency services. Hostile surveillance isn't covered under the original agreement. I pulled out my phone. I should probably report this to the sheriff as well. Commercial photography on private property, possible stalking charges, harassment of a senior citizen? You can't be serious. Margaret, you've taught me that community standards must be enforced consistently. I'm just applying your own principles. She backed away, camera clutched to her chest, and I swear I could see steam rising from her ears. That evening, Richard Henderson knocked on my door alone. He looked exhausted. Frank, my wife is. She's not handling this well. Is there any way we can work something out? I invited him in for coffee. Richard was actually a decent guy when separated from Margaret's influence, intelligent, successful, and clearly embarrassed by his wife's behavior. Honestly, Richard, I just want to fish in peace. But Margaret declared war on me for no reason except personal spite. She gets fixated on things. Always has. Usually it's renovating the house or planning parties, but sometimes… He rubbed his temples. She destroyed our relationship with our previous neighbors over a property line dispute that cost us $30,000 in legal fees. Why didn't you stop her? Have you tried stopping Margaret when she's decided she's right about something? Richard laughed bitterly. I work 14-hour days to avoid coming home to whatever crusade she's launched that week. I felt a flicker of sympathy for the man, but not enough to abandon my plan. The application process is fair and reasonable, Richard. Margaret could end this tomorrow by simply filling out the paperwork like everyone else. She won't. Her pride won't let her admit she was wrong. Then I guess we're at an impasse. Richard finished his coffee and shook his head. Frank, you have no idea how far she'll take this. Margaret doesn't lose. She escalates. Richard's warning proved prophetic. The following Monday, every Willowbrook Estates resident received an emergency HOA meeting notice. The agenda had one item: legal action against fraudulent property claims. Margaret had hired an attorney. The community center was packed Tuesday night. Word had spread beyond our neighborhood apparently. Our little drama had become coffee shop gossip across 3 zip codes. I recognized several faces that didn't belong to our subdivision, including a reporter from the local paper. Margaret's lawyer was a sharp-dressed young man named Bradley Morrison. No relation to Janet, he assured everyone. He'd clearly been briefed to treat this as a slam-dunk case. Ladies and gentlemen, my client has uncovered what amounts to a fraudulent land grab designed to extort money from innocent homeowners, Bradley began. Mr. Thompson's so-called water rights purchases violates multiple HOA covenants and possibly state regulations regarding community amenities. He'd prepared his own PowerPoint presentation, complete with legal citations and precedent cases. According to Bradley, community lakes were protected under homeowner association law. My purchase was invalid due to failure to notify affected parties, and my permit system constituted illegal taxation. It was impressive. Also completely wrong. When Bradley finished, I stood up slowly. Thank you for that creative interpretation, Mr. Morrison. I wonder if you'd be willing to review some additional documentation? I handed him copies of my deed, the original ranch survey, and 3 independent legal opinions David had commissioned. You'll notice the lake was never included in the original HOA agreement. The developer never owned the water and therefore couldn't grant lake access rights to the homeowner association. Bradley's confidence wavered as he scanned the documents. This will require further research. Take your time. But I should mention that every day your clients use my lake without permission constitutes ongoing trespass. The fines are accumulating. Margaret jumped to her feet. What fines? Standard trespassing penalties in this county are $200 per incident. I've been keeping detailed logs. I produced a thick folder. Dr. Wells has 37 violations so far. Janet Morrison has 22. Bob Cunningham is up to 41, mostly from unauthorized fishing. The room erupted. Residents demanded to know if I was serious, whether the fines were legally enforceable, and what would happen to their property values if lake access was permanently restricted. Bradley tried to regain control. These alleged fines have no legal standing? Actually, they do. David Kim stood up from the back of the room. I hadn't told anyone he'd be there. I'm Mr. Thompson's attorney, and I've reviewed every aspect of his water rights purchase. The lake ownership is completely legitimate, and trespassing penalties are established under state law. He walked to the front and placed a thick legal brief on the table. I've also prepared a countersuit for harassment, property damage, some of those unauthorized fishing trips, left trash on the shoreline, and attempted fraud regarding the HOA's claim to lake ownership. The room went dead silent. Furthermore, any legal challenge to my client's ownership will result in immediate cessation of all lake access pending resolution. That includes dock usage, since all docks extend over private property. Margaret's face had gone from purple to white. You can't cut off dock access. Our property values will reflect the reality that you never owned the lake to begin with, David finished. The current situation is actually generous. My client is allowing continued access through a reasonable permit system instead of banning all usage outright. Bradley Morrison was frantically whispering with Margaret, clearly realizing his case had more holes than a colander. Tom Rodriguez raised his hand. What happens to those of us who've already applied for permits? Applications are being processed in the order received, I answered. Approved applicants will receive full lake access for the remainder of the season. And next year? Someone called out, depends on how well this year's permit holders follow the rules. After the meeting, Margaret cornered me in the parking lot. Her usual composure had cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. This isn't over, Frank. I'll fight you in court for years if I have to. Margaret, why? All of this could have been avoided if you'd just let me fish in peace. You don't belong here. The words came out like a physical blow. This is a quality neighborhood. We have standards, property values, reputation. And fishing somehow threatens all of that? It's not about fishing? She was almost screaming now. It's about people knowing their place, following rules, respecting authority. That's when I understood. This was never about fishing or property values or community standards. Margaret Henderson needed to be in control, needed to dominate her little kingdom, and I'd committed the unforgivable sin of not submitting to her authority. I followed your rules, Margaret. Filed applications, paid fines, jumped through every hoop you created. But it was never enough, was it? You wouldn't be satisfied until I was gone. You could still leave, she said quietly. Sell your house. Move somewhere more suitable. I looked at her standing there in the parking lot. Designer handbag, clutched like a weapon. Perfectly styled hair, finally showing signs of strain. Margaret Henderson had spent so much energy trying to control other people that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be powerless. No, Margaret. I'm exactly where I belong. Over the next 2 weeks, the permit applications revealed the true dynamics of Willowbrook Estates. Residents who'd been quietly resentful of Margaret's dictatorial HOA management saw an opportunity to express their feelings through character references. Tom Rodriguez's application included testimonials from 6 neighbors praising his helpfulness and integrity. Sarah Chen received glowing references from residents who appreciated her quiet consideration. Even some of Margaret's former allies began submitting applications, clearly deciding that lake access was more valuable than political loyalty. But the inner circle held firm. Margaret, Dr. Wells, Janet Morrison, and Bob Cunningham refused to apply, convinced that their legal challenge would restore the status quo. They were about to learn how expensive that conviction would be. On Halloween morning, I had a professional process server deliver trespassing notices to all 4 holdouts. The notices were formal, legal, and absolutely terrifying in their precision. Each document listed specific dates, times, and locations of violations, along with accumulated fines and legal costs. Dr. Wells owed $7,400 for swimming violation. Janet Morrison faced $4,600 in dock usage fees. Bob Cunningham's unauthorized fishing had generated $8,200 in penalties. Margaret's total, including dog walking, photography, and dock usage violations, reached $12,800. Total claimed damages, $33,000. The notices gave them 48 hours to pay or face formal trespassing charges. That afternoon, my phone rang continuously. Not from the holdouts, but from their spouses, children, and friends begging me to be reasonable. Richard Henderson called 3 times. Dr. Wells' husband tried to negotiate a payment plan. Even Janet Morrison's elderly mother phoned to plead for mercy. But I'd learned from Margaret herself that selective enforcement of arbitrary rules was perfectly acceptable community management. Wednesday morning brought the sheriff's deputy to my door for the second time in 6 months. Deputy Martinez was the same officer who'd served me Margaret's cease and desist order back when this whole mess started. "Mr. Thompson, we've got 4 trespassing complaints against you for harassment and extortion. I need to hear your side of this situation." I invited him in for coffee and laid out the entire timeline: Margaret's original fishing ban, the escalating harassment, my property purchase, and the legal warnings about continued trespassing. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Deputy Martinez said slowly. "You bought the lake to spite your HOA president?" "I bought the lake to ensure my legal right to fish. The spite was just a bonus." He laughed, despite himself. "And now you're charging them to use water they thought they owned?" "I'm offering reasonable access to private property. They can pay the fees, or they can stay on dry land." Deputy Martinez reviewed my documentation, the water rights deed, trespassing notices, and photographic evidence of violations. Everything was legally airtight. "Mr. Thompson, I have to ask, are you actually going to prosecute these people for trespassing?" "Depends. Are they going to continue trespassing? What if they agree to stop using the lake?" "I considered this. Deputy, I've offered a reasonable compromise. Anyone can apply for lake access through a simple permit system. 4 residents have chosen to ignore that option and continue illegal usage of my property. At what point does law enforcement step in to protect property rights?" He nodded slowly. "You want me to arrest them if they keep trespassing?" "I want them to follow the same law that applies to everyone else. If I walked into their backyards without permission, you'd arrest me." "Fair enough. I'll have a talk with the complainants about property law." Deputy Martinez left, and I watched from my window as he visited each of the holdouts. The conversations were short, but animated. Margaret gestured wildly during her discussion. Dr. Wells kept shaking her head. Bob Cunningham looked like he might cry. By Thursday, the trespassing had stopped. But Margaret's next move would make the previous drama seem like a friendly disagreement. Margaret's retaliation came through official channels. On Friday, I received certified letters from the County Health Department, Environmental Protection Agency, and Building Code Enforcement. Someone had filed complaints about potential water contamination, unpermitted dock modifications, and possible violations of wetland protection laws. Each agency required inspections, environmental testing, and detailed documentation of lake management practices. The potential fines for violations ranged from $500 to $50,000. Margaret had decided that if she couldn't use the lake, she'd try to shut it down entirely. I called David Kim immediately. "This is harassment, plain and simple," David said after reviewing the complaints. "But we'll need to take each one seriously. Any actual violations could jeopardize your ownership. How long will the inspections take? Months, potentially. And they're expensive. You'll be paying for water testing, environmental surveys, engineering reports." She's trying to make lake ownership cost prohibitive. That weekend, I walked the entire shoreline, looking at my property with fresh eyes. 50 acres of pristine water, surrounded by million-dollar homes. Margaret was right about one thing: this was a valuable asset, but she'd made a critical error in her scorched earth strategy. She'd reminded me that I owned more than just fishing rights. I owned the entire lake. Monday morning, I called a meeting with Tom Rodriguez and Sarah Chen. Both had received their approved lake permits and had been quietly enjoying the drama from the sidelines. "I need to ask you both something," I began. "How would you feel about some changes around the lake?" "What kind of changes?" Sarah asked. I spread out a survey map on Tom's kitchen table. "Well, I own 50 acres of water, and the land rights extend down to the lake bottom. Technically, I could drain the entire lake if I wanted to." Tom's eyes widened. "You wouldn't." "No, but I could also do the opposite. Dam the outlet, raise the water level, expand the lake boundaries." "How much could you expand it?" Sarah leaned over the map. "According to this topographical survey, I could add about 12 acres before reaching anyone's house foundation. But that would put several docks underwater and flood some of the smaller yard areas." "Including Margaret's backyard?" Tom asked, with a grin. "Her entire patio and garden area would be under about 3 feet of water." Sarah whistled softly. "That's diabolical. Also probably illegal." "Actually, it's not. The environmental impact study for lake expansion was completed back in 2019 when Mountain Vista considered it for recreational development. The project was approved but never implemented due to cost concerns." I pulled out another set of documents. "I've been researching this all weekend. As the water rights owner, I have legal authority to modify.